sailboats are very interesting places. It's kind of like a different world, because if you're on a sailboat, you're really offshore. The usual things on which you depend aren't there, and there's no safety net, really. I mean, it either works or it doesn't work, and it's very kind of blatant. You can see that it worked or it didn't work. And what happens on a sailboat is not a lot of telling people what to do. What happens on a sailboat that is a well-run ship is that there's an opening for people to act effectively. And I remember, for instance, I once sailed to Hawaii, and one of the things that those of you who don't sail should know, bad things only happen at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they only happen when the weather's bad. All the bad things wait. They store it up all day long when it's sunny and pleasant out and everybody's awake, and they only happen when it's bad. And what happened was that one of the lines that held the sail up chafed through. And never mind all the technical noise, but everybody had to get out of their bunks and scramble up on deck, and the boat was pitching, and it was pitch black, and the wind was blowing, and it was a good thing nobody needed a lot of orders, because they wouldn't have been able to hear the orders anyhow over the noise of the wind. But it has always struck me very deeply how people could work together without a lot of instruction, without being told what to do, and that they could work together so cooperatively. And I always said, why should that be limited to a sailboat? Why can't we get that on shore?
The material for this audio tape was recorded at 4 consecutive sessions of a live nationally broadcast seminar series offered by Werner, Erhard and Associates and conducted by Werner Erhard. On the tape, you will hear Werner Erhard working with different men and women as they carve out the distinctions of leadership that will be useful to them in accomplishing their own goals and commitments.
Now, we're going to do 4 sessions on leadership, and there's lots of work to do. However, the very first thing that I want us to engage in, the first thing I want to inquire into, is the issue of leadership itself. And I want to give you a kind of story that'll have 2 or 3 players in the story, 2 or 3 characters in the story, and I'd like you to look at leadership from each of the characters' perspective. So this is a story about tennis. My new concern, you see. And in my study of coaching, I've had to pick a subject about which to be coached, and one of the guys for whom I have enormous respect happens to be a tennis coach, so consequently I'm studying tennis, but not really. I'm actually studying coaching with a tennis coach. So we play tennis. And in tennis, there's a court and 2 or 4 people on the court and a net and lines and a ball and a racket. And what we ordinarily don't notice, but which is present in every game of tennis, is there are stands with people sitting in the stands watching the game. Now, you may play on a tennis court where there's nobody around. As a matter of fact, you may have a wall against which you play tennis. You know, you bang the ball up against the wall and it comes back, and you don't even have an opponent, like a live opponent, and you think you're playing tennis by yourself with no observers. But remember, you're always the observer. You are your own observer. And as a matter of fact, most people, in most situations in life, while they think they're on the court playing, are really in the stands observing. And they live as the observer. So I want to establish, I want to create, I want to generate a world, a distinction called the domain of an observer giving an account. Tennis lives, life lives, leadership lives in the domain of an observer giving an account. So there's a tennis game going on in the stands. even when you're your own stands and you happen to have a racket in your hand, be standing on the court. But I want you to start establishing for yourself like a distinction, like a domain, like a distinct domain, that life can live, life can show up, life can be lived in the domain of an observer giving an account. We think life is lived in the action, and that there's a commentary that goes along with the action. Now I'm asking you to bring forth out of the background of all of it a distinct domain in which life shows up. Life is there. Where you find life is up in the stands. There's a game going on in the stands. And it's going on in the observation of an observer giving an account. It's not just pure observation. It's not a movie camera making a record. It's a movie camera making a record with a commentary and significances and meaning and assessments and judgments and values and all of that stuff. So, we've got this domain of distinction in which leadership can show up. And that one domain of distinction is the domain of an observer giving an account. Now I want to bring forth from this background another domain of distinction, and the other domain of distinction is the domain called presence. Tennis as a presence. Now one of the things that I'd like you to see is that in tennis, like a presence, there isn't a tennis racket. I want you to notice that the racket is rarely, if ever, actually present in the game called tennis. And yet, up in the stands, that racket is something very, very present. When you're really playing tennis, when you're really into the game and it's going well, you aren't present. If you can kind of remember back to some activity in which you were thoroughly engaged and totally engaged, and something really happening, you'll notice that you are not there like an identity. There's no George down on the court for you. But remember, up in the stands, in the domain of an observer giving an account, there's really a George there. So, there's a distinction between the showing up of leadership like a presence and the showing up of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. For the most part, it's true that you and I live in the domain of the observer giving the account. Now, I've told two lies, which I want to clear up. They're technical lies, and therefore important later. And that's why I want to clean them up now. Number one, for a great tennis player, the racket is actually present, but in a way that's unusual from our ordinary everyday perspective. It's present as transparent. So present as transparent is different than not present. Something can be present as transparent. See, I just happened to look down at Charlie, and I was thinking back to when I was racing. When I first began to race, the car was very there. You know, the shift lever and the clutch and the steering wheel and the wheels and the track and the road, and all that stuff got to be very, very, like up in my face, present. And when I actually started to be able to drive a race car, like be a race car driver, the car became transparent to the driving, to the racing. The car became transparent to the racing. So, I wanted you to be clear that presence doesn't mean noticed or focused on or up in your face or what you might call experienced. Because when things are most present, they're often transparent. Transparency may be the height of presence. Now, I don't want you to take that like some dictate that I'm giving you, but rather something to kind of work with and consider. Can you bring the tools of living up to the level of transparency? And is it possible that something is most powerfully present when it's transparent? And it's not like not being there, which we often say that's powerful, but being there transparently, maybe. See, I say it like a assertion to begin with, but I don't really want to give it to you as an assertion. There's no power that way. I'm inviting you to inquire into the nature of presence as a distinction, including the possibility of transparency as a very powerful presence. Okay, the other lie that I told you was to say that we live in the domain of an observer giving an account. That's not true. We actually live in a domain of a collapsed distinction in which the distinction of observer giving an account isn't distinguished. So while I gave us credit for too much, we're really not that far along. We don't even live in a domain of an observer giving an account. That wouldn't be so bad. We live in these collapsed distinctions in which nothing is distinct. But for the moment, it's useful to say that for the most part, particularly with this issue of leadership, we live in the domain of an observer giving an account. The thing I want you now to start to inquire into, to engage with, is that leadership as a phenomenon in the domain of an observer giving an account is an entirely distinct phenomenon from leadership as a presence. If you learn what there is to learn about leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, if you master leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, you may never be able to exercise leadership. Because leadership exercised lives in the domain of presence. It lives in action. It lives as a presence. It doesn't live in the domain of an observer giving an account. I dare say that almost everything you know about leadership is known in the domain of an observer giving an account. If you read most books on leadership, they absolutely do not address leadership as a presence. Now, I want to start teasing that out with you. So first off, I want you to kind of remember a time when you've been in the presence of leadership. Either your own or someone else's. But you've been in the presence of leadership, and I want to ask you, if you did an investigation, could you find leadership any place? When you're being a leader, is there leadership any place like a presence? Yeah, in the conversation of the people who are watching you, observing, giving an account, there's leadership there. Where is it? It's in their mouth as a conversation and in their structure of interpretation as an observation. But I'm talking about like a presence. If you walk into the office of a man or a woman who's a real leader, do you find any leadership in their pockets? Do you find any leadership in their pocketbook, in the drawers of their desk, in the waste paper basket, under the rug, hiding in the corner? Can you find leadership any place? The answer is no. As a phenomenon, there is no such a thing as leadership as a presence. And that's the first shocking realization that you must come to in order to conduct an authentic, empowering inquiry into the possibility of leadership. It's kind of like there's no such thing as leadership. And in order to inquire into leadership in a way that can make a difference, like opening a clearing for your leadership, opening a clearing for your mastery of leadership, the first thing you got to know is there's no such thing. You never find leadership. If you think about, try to remember, not like a story, but being in the presence of those moments when you were a leader, you'll notice that the notion of leadership wasn't even there. It's not until afterwards that you say, oh my God, man, I was leading. Hey, not bad. But by that time you're up in the stands. So you're no longer on the court. Down on the court, there is no leadership. And what we're going to want to do is to inquire what is present on the court in those moments in the stand, and those moments when in the stand there's a conversation about leadership going on in the court. What's actually down there? Like, really? Because there ain't no leadership down there. What's really down there? See, what is it that you've got to be correlated with? What is it you've got to be dancing with such that your saying isn't merely arbitrary? What is it that empowers people saying? That's the question of this 4 sessions, really. Because if you got that, you may not be able to write the book on leader, but you are a leader. You may not be able to have interesting, sterling conversations about leadership with which to impress people, but you will be a leader. Fabulous opportunity. I mean, incredible. Like, really brings me to the edge of my seat. What is this thing? See, I don't want an answer. I'm not looking for the answer. I'm looking to engage in the question such that I am in that domain. And that's the listening which I'm inviting you to bring to the seminar. I want to be with it. And I want us to be related in such a way that the possibility of your being with it is present for you. I don't care whether you got the answer. In fact, that would be disinteresting. I mean, suppose somebody did have the answer. Suppose Elizabeth had the answer. She said, oh, I know the answer. She told us the answer. Like, oh, so what? Really, who would care? There's a way of inquiring. And that way of inquiring that I'm describing, I call transformation. There's a way of inquiring or being engaged with something such that you're empowered with respect to it rather than more able to talk about it afterwards. I know I've read this to some of you before, and I want to read it again anyhow, both as a review and for those who haven't heard it, to hear it for the first time. This is from Martin Heidegger on the Way to Language. It's a conversation between Martin Heidegger and a Japanese philosopher, one of whose professors had been trained by Heidegger. So the Japanese says, we Japanese do not think it strange if a dialogue leaves undefined what is really intended, or even restores it back to the keeping of the undefinable. Heidegger responds, that is part, I believe, of every dialogue that has turned out well between thinking beings. What Heidegger means by thinking is very much different than what an anybody self means by thinking. As if of its own accord, Heidegger says, it can take care that that undefinable something not only does not slip away, but displays its gathering force ever more luminously in the course of the dialogue. That's the methodology of the seminar. That's the methodology of transformation. Not a definition, not a description, not a narrative, not a story, not an understanding, not information. But whatever it is that he's speaking about when he says, displays its gathering force ever more luminously in the course of the dialogue. And he doesn't mean display like something to look at, but rather something to be. The Japanese response, our dialogues with our teacher probably failed to turn out so well. we younger men challenged him much too directly to satisfy our thirst for handy information. We are a culture that listens for handy information. Something's useless if you can't use it, isn't it? You see, maybe what empowers people cannot be used by them. Maybe we need a kind of listening that can be present for what is powerful and not useful. Heidegger responds, thirst for knowledge and greed for explanations never lead to a thinking inquiry, transformational inquiry. Curiosity is always the concealed arrogance of a self-consciousness that banks on a self-invented rationality. What does he mean by that? He means that you think that you were born in such a way that anything which is valid, you are going to understand. Therefore, anything you don't understand must be invalid. That's what he means. The will to know does not will to abide before what is worthy of thought. He's saying there exactly what I just said a moment ago. That this will for information, this will for tips, this will for prescriptions, this will for how am I going to use it? How does this apply? How am I going to fix it? How is this going to help me to fix it? Is no will to be with what is worthy of being with. It's different to be with than the will for knowledge or information or usefulness.
In the next section, Werner goes on to speak about what actually makes a difference in terms of effective action and leadership.
You know, in the normal course of events, what one is left with after doing work on something is a kind of menu of decisions that one has made. One has decided that, well, from now on I'm going to stop doing this, and I am going to do that. I call those something like New Year's resolutions. And I think that they're just about as effective as most New Year's resolutions. That is to say that they have little or no effect at all. So I'm saying a kind of very strange thing. I'm almost saying that what we learn doesn't make much difference. And that's a kind of strange way of looking at things. Because we live in a culture which says that the way you get confident about something, the way you get able about something, the way you get skillful about something is that you learn. And maybe in another sense of the word learn, I might accept that. But in the ordinary sense of the word learn, like gathering information, seeing what you did wrong, seeing what you might do right now, all of that kind of analysis, all of that stuff that leads up to understanding, in this case, what leadership is, like a set of characteristics or a set of properties which either you don't have and ought to get, or which you do have and therefore ought to feel confident about. For me, there's no power in that. There's no power in learning about leadership. And it makes it difficult. The fact that there's no power in learning about leadership makes the whole issue difficult. And why it makes it difficult is because essentially the listening that we are, the commitment that we are, is the learning about. We're already well organized to learn about something, like get the information and get the data, and I'm suggesting to you that that doesn't make any difference. So, the question is, what does make a difference? If that doesn't make any difference, what does make a difference? What is it that allows what we would call skill or ability or being a leader, so to speak, to actually be present in our lives, in our everyday concerns, and in our everyday being in the world? And I'm suggesting to you that you try out the possibility that being engaged in an inquiry about something being engaged in an inquiry in a certain way, a certain kind of inquiring about something, allows not for a gathering of information or making a series of decisions or understanding what it is that you're dealing with, but that being engaged in an inquiry with regard to a certain issue, if the inquiry is engaged in a particular way, actually lets what it is that you might find out about in another situation actually be present in your life. And that's really all that interests me, is being a leader, not understanding leadership or having information about leadership. So we've created a set of distinctions as a tool for an inquiry. Not that these distinctions are the distinctions, and not that they're not, but we've created a set of distinctions as a tool for an inquiry. And the set of distinctions that we've created is leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account, and leadership in the domain of presence. And one of the things that I'd like you to come out of this seminar with is some mastery of the kind of inquiry, the conducting of which leaves you with a greater opening for being that into which you're inquiring. Could you follow that sentence? So, I'm going to start hammering at this issue about leadership as a presence, because it's very much not like what we think it is. But while you're listening to the conversation of hammering out leadership as a presence, I'd like you also to be listening to an inquiry conducted with a set of distinctions called the domain of an observer giving an account in the domain of presence. What I mean by presence defies definition. Well, what do I mean like a presence? Give me a definition of presence. What do you mean by presence? Do you mean something that's physically there, something I can observe with my eyes and my ears and my nose and my sense of touch and my sense of smell? What do you mean as a presence? So the answer is that I don't have a definition, because what I mean by a presence is simply something like an opening that's distinct from the opening called the domain of an observer giving an account. Now this is a very difficult part of the work, because we always want to get these tools shaped up very clearly. We want to know what is presence. And the answer to that is that there's no answer to that makes any difference. It's the question, what is presence, that makes a difference. And this starts to get pretty difficult now, you see. You're engaged in an inquiry about the nature of leadership using a tool which you own, namely the tool of what is leadership like a presence, which tool you own like an inquiry. Pretty strange stuff. You're inquiring with an inquiry. Makes it difficult. This is not easy. This is not ordinary. And so it's going to require a kind of extraordinary listening on our part, and really some training on our part. This is kind of like Aikido. And it's not something you learn in one session. It's something you have to be with until you are the possibility which it is. Yeah, you do all the exercises, and you go through all the training, but nobody teaches you Aikido. You're in the presence of being coached in Aikido until you show up as Aikido. And this is very much like that. This is not something you learn to do like a series of steps you take, but something for which you are present with the intention that you show up as what this is. Essentially, what I'd like to do is to hear from you about what you discovered in this kind of inquiry into the distinction between leadership as a kind of how it looks in the stands, leadership as an account, and leadership as a practice. And
for as long as I can remember, I watched to see what are leaders, what do they look like, what do they do. And I remembered in looking after the last seminar, like at 5th grade or something, and I had to be the captain of the service squad girls. I mean, then I'd be a leader. And then all my life has been about looking to see what it is that a leader is, and then doing that.
Okay, now hold on, because Anne's saying something a lot more profound than we may be listening to. She's not just describing Anne. She's describing the culture of being which we are. See, it's not like Anne went through this process saying, what is a leader? It's not like Anne had these thoughts or this conversation with herself, what is a leader? But rather something like the culture of being in which you and I showed up as human beings is a clearing for leadership as an is, like a body or a bag of properties or characteristics. This is not, Anne's not giving you an insight into herself merely. She's giving you an insight into what it is to be human vis-a-vis the issue or the phenomenon of leadership. And she's saying something very powerful, that you and I are an opening for leadership like a set of properties, like something which is. It's as if what a leader is, like doing, is a list of prescriptions for action. And that if you were going to... Now remember, you see, you and I have the notion that there's something over there called leadership. And that our job is to get it right in here, like represent it right over here, so that we can match what's over there. That's the underlying thing that none of us is saying. That's so taken for granted that we never even notice that about ourselves. The structure of interpretation which we are is that there's leadership over there. Our job is to get it right in here like a description, like a representation of what's over there, so that we can act and be like what's over there. Remember that that's only a structure of interpretation. Everything I just said is not necessarily the way it is, but rather is the way we have it. That's just the way we have it. It's not necessarily like that. It's not necessarily true that there's something over there. It's not necessarily true if there is something over there that it can be represented over here. It's not necessarily true that if we represent it over here, we could duplicate what is over there out of the representation here. All of that's up for grabs. All of that's questionable. All of that needs to be inquired into. In the moments of greatest power, you're never following a prescription. You're never acting out of a strategy. You're really kind of in a dance with the world. And somehow the world with which you are dancing is an opportunity or an opening or a clearing. That's very different than following a prescription, following a strategy. It's very different than being the victim of the circumstances out there. To be in a dance with life as an opening, as an opportunity, as a clearing, is very different than figuring your way through the circumstances. Okay, I want to stop what we're doing and shift ourselves to the question, what is leadership as a presence? What's on the court when you're on the court, rather than what's on the court when you're up in the stands? What's actually there like a presence? Peter?
Watching somebody else.
Okay, very good. So up in the stand. So if we stand back from the whole thing, there was you up in the stands watching somebody else. Now you notice something down with the people you were watching, which is the comment of an observer giving an account. When you were giving that account, what was the guy and the gal down on the court, what was present? Now let me give you a little clue about how to do this. So one of the things that I imagine was present was somebody. Is that true?
Right.
There was actually somebody there. It was not an empty court. So one of the things that Peter is saying to us in this inquiry is maybe one of the things that's present in leadership down on the court is somebody. That as a presence, leadership, at least a part of what's there is somebody.
Yeah. Somebody's doing something.
You don't get leadership on an empty court. A battlefield with no personnel has no possibility for the presence of leadership. Yes?
Right.
A family, a house with no people in it, has no possibility for leadership. So this is kind of obvious, but at least it's a place to start. That leadership as a presence is people. Okay, so what else is there? Like a presence. People, we got that much. What else? Like a presence is present.
There's action. There's
Okay, but what action? Okay, let's just stay with that. There's action. So, leadership as a presence presences itself as action. People in action. See, what is hard about this is that you've got all conversation as descriptive, representational. I want you to open up the possibility of a conversation for presence, not a conversation for a description of what was present. So people in action. And we're not meaning to represent what's there, we're meaning to say what's there. People in action, what else? So leadership, there's no such thing as leadership. Peter's saying there's no such thing as leadership. If you're standing up in the stands, you can have a conversation about leadership, but the guys down on the court, there's no leadership down there. What's down there is people in action.
So all I have is a description of it, an observation.
Good. Now I want you to get down on the court and tell me what's there. So far, what you've got down there is people in action.
So there's a commitment.
No, can't see commitment. Not a presence. I don't mean you can't see it, therefore it's not a presence, but I'm trying to kind of engage you in how do you inquire into presence. See, is commitment ever present? No, that's always a conversation, an assessment about what's going on there. But the commitment itself is never present. What is present when up in the stands we say commitment? What prompts us to say commitment? What's actually present there?
I don't know.
Try this. Something about unrestrained action. Maybe something like unrestrained action. Maybe something like consistent action. Maybe something like a repetitive action. Maybe something like action powerful enough to meet a resistance. I don't know. See, I don't know. And I don't care about the answer. What I care about is establishing ourselves in the domain of leadership as a presence. That's what this is all about. It's a trick. This is not really to get the answer. We're not going to give you a test to see if you got the answers right afterwards. You get as much out of this with the wrong answers. The point is to be here, creating yourself as a clearing for leadership as a presence, and you do that by engaging in the dialogue which the conversation is.
Is it action without concern?
Okay, good. Now, what does concern mean? See, no matter what he says, I'm going to have a question, aren't I? Why? Because I don't care about the answer. And besides which, if he gives us an answer that blows something open, nobody will not know that. That would be obvious. Yeah, so okay, something like an action without a concern, but you can't see an absence of concern down on the court, can you? What's there on the court when you and I, Peter, are saying that's commitment? What we mean by that is that's action without concern.
Anything I can think of is a description.
Yeah, it's okay. That's right. And every time you say it, I'm going to say that's a description of what's underneath that. Because, I'm going to say this 1,000 times a day. I can feel it coming. Because it's the inquiry where the power is, not the information you derive from the inquiry. Look, we've invented a new technology. We've invented a technology called ontological inquiry. Really, that's wrong. We've invented a technology called ontological design. The way you do ontological design is like Peter and I are doing it. Maybe it's this. But how could it be that? What's underneath that? Well, underneath that is this. Okay, but how could it be that? What's underneath that? And somehow, if Peter and I are doing this correctly, when we're all done, neither one of us will know anything we didn't know before, but life will now be an opening for that into which we've inquired. So Peter and I will find ourselves not remembering what to do to be leaders, or not remembering what property we need to have to be leaders, but rather we will find ourselves being leaders. If this works. That's strange. Nobody's ever worked in that before. And it doesn't satisfy the ordinary listening which we are for information. What was our last maybe?
Action without concern.
Yeah. So what? It can't be not concerned isn't present. Okay, now look, down there on the court, can I stop speaking up here in the stands and speak in the court? Now maybe I'd want to say that what's present that I'm calling action without concern is a kind of dancing with the world. That when I'm up in the stand saying, a leader is one who acts without concern, what is actually present on the court is a dancing with the world. A kind of, because that kind of fits a little bit, doesn't it? What we would say up in the stands is, look at that guy move. No concerns. But really what's going on down there on the court is, what's happening is a dancing with the world. That looks up in the stands like an action without concern, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Even though present on the court may be a deep concern. What dancing with the world would look like in the stands is action without concern. Even if there was a dancing with the world on the court that included lots of concerns, even self-doubt. See, what self-doubt and dancing with the world looks like up in the stands is action without concern. So now if you go around trying to act without concern, you get to be a nitwit, not a leader. if in fact what leadership is, like a presence, is a dancing with the world in the presence of one's concerns? But I don't know that any of that's accurate. And I don't much care. I care about a rigorous inquiry. Because I say that a well-designed, rigorous inquiry, while not leading to answers, while not leading to information, while not leading necessarily to understanding, leads to an opening, like a possibility, like a clearing for that into which I'm inquiring, in this case, leadership. Are we together?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay. Now I want to switch back. Now I want to know not what is leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. So I don't want examples, except if you give examples to get to what I do want, which is, I want to know what is the nature of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. What is the nature of leadership there? Like, I mean something, when I say nature, I mean something closer to what are the principles, or what are the design elements. I don't want examples of the design. I want the design elements. That's the question. Robert?
One of the design elements seems to be consistently produces results, can be counted upon to produce results, a lot of results, even extraordinary results, consistently. And what I find fascinating when these people are interviewed with, or when you read their conversations, is it's whether they've scored 100 touchdowns, won 5 Academy Awards, it's grist for the mill for them.
Right.
It has a kind of ordinary everydayness to them, and it's a distinction that we make up here in the stands.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I want to get into that more, so let's mark that, because I want to look at that from both sides. Very good. Okay, I'm going to give you some answers. I'm going to give them to you as maybes. Maybe leadership, maybe one of the design elements of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account is the element called properties. In other words, the conversation in the stands lives in a structure of interpretation that says that leadership is a matter of properties. And if you read the books on leadership, what you discover is that they're often about the properties of leaders. So somebody say out loud one of the properties of a leader. Assertiveness. Okay. Confidence. Yeah. Courage. Vision. What? Flexibility. What was that? Grace under pressure. All right, look. So, yeah, all right, look, hold on for a second. Because we could come up with an endless list. And some of them would actually be mutually exclusive. You have to be both left and right. All I want you to see is that in the domain of an observer giving an account, leadership is always going to show up as a body of properties lying inside the leader. A body of properties located in the leader. So what I need us to begin to see is that who we are is that leadership is a function of properties inside of us. Now, what I want us to begin to question here is whether that could ever be a way of being with leadership that was going to make any difference. How do you get properties inside yourself? Where do you get this courage stuff? And how do you get it inside? Can you begin to see that there's a certain weakness in that interpretation? That there's a certain weakness in this interpretation that leaders have properties inside themselves. The first off, the notion of inside themselves is kind of silly on its face. And then the idea that there are such properties, I don't know, where are they, free floating, or they grow on trees, or where the hell are these properties which wound up in them? And how did they get them in there? I mean, each of the questions brings you face to face with the absurdity of the interpretation. So now, I've given you an example of a design characteristic of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account. That it has to do with properties inside the person who's the leader. What are some of the other design elements? And it's more important that you're asking the question than that you got an answer. What are some of the other design elements of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account? Let me give another suggestion. Another suggestion would be the division of the world into leaders and followers. People who lead and people who follow. Now that can get very complex and very subtle, where there's a kind of relationship between the leaders and followers aren't really followers, but people who are leading and all that noise. But nevertheless, it's inherent in the domain of the observer given an account, leadership, that there's this kind of separation, division, between a leader and a follower. Now, sometimes the followers are leaders, and sometimes the leaders are followers, and I hate that cuteness about leaders standing behind the people they're following. I know all of the nice things to say about being a leader, all of the denials, and I have respect for none of them. Because somewhere, somehow, down in the guts of leadership in the domain of an observer giving an account is this structure of interpretation which divides the leader from the followers. Okay, the next aspect that I'd like to get into is the role of vision in leadership and the nature of vision and what that all has to do with. One of the things that I want to get clear about is that vision doesn't have much to do with leadership as a presence, I think. I just can't kind of, when I do these thought experiments, see any vision down there on the playing floor. And yet, I somehow am not able to rule out the power that vision has in the phenomenon of leadership. So, what that suggests to me is the need to invent another domain of distinction for leadership to live in. And where that takes... Can I read this to you and get that out of the way so I can erase it? It's just a very, very, very useful quote from a Nobel laureate that says, to undertake a project, as the word's derivation indicates, means to cast out an idea ahead of oneself so that it gains autonomy. That is to say, so that it's no longer dependent on the person who undertook the project in the first place, so that the project gains autonomy and is fulfilled not only by the efforts of its originator, but indeed independently of him as well. And another word which I think is very important is the word independently. What could that mean? A project, most projects worth doing are going to be realized not only by the efforts of its originator, but indeed independent of the originator. So I thought that was valuable, but who knows? At any rate, what I wanted to get to here was this issue about vision. And as I said, what we've got so far is really two domains. The domain of the observer giving an account. So the domain of the account, the domain in which leadership lives as something you represent, something you talk about, something with properties and characteristics, something you can describe, something you can define, like that. And leadership as a presence, like what's actually there on the court. Now we've got this problem about vision. And if we take up the issue of vision and its role in leadership, and we're only armed with these two distinctions, my guess is that it's going to get us in trouble someplace down the pike, because it means either that the vision lives there as a presence, which at least in my being with what's present when leadership is present, I just can't see any of. I can't see the vision present there, and I know that the vision is present or often present in the domain of an observer giving an account, but I'm concerned lest the kind of power that's available in the domain of an observer giving an account isn't a powerful enough domain of distinction for vision to live in. So that's why I left this kind of empty spot at the other end of the board where we may have to invent a domain for vision which isn't a part of the tools that we've already got. But let's take a look at vision in the domain which we already do have, the one we inherit as human beings, this domain of the observer giving an account, and see what a vision might be like in that domain. So first off, I'm going to suggest that a vision in a domain of an observer giving an account is something like a dream about remote possibilities that you consider an ideal. And the operative word that I want to get in there is the word ideal. And I'd like to invite you to consider that what we think of as our vision is something very akin to an ideal, something which ought to be, something imbued with a rightness. And I want to underline that word. An ideal is something that we've imbued with a kind of rightness. There's something about our ideals that make them right. And with regard to what distinguishes the vision of a leader and what distinguishes all other kind of visioning, I have the sense that while in the domain of an observer giving an account, all vision looks like some kind of an ideal, that what's actually there, and I won't say present, but there in some way, with vision in the realm of leadership is not an ideal, not something right, not something that ought to be, although when the leader speaks about vision, the vision in the domain of an observer giving an account, it will probably be made right and probably be made ideal. But I'm trying to say that what makes a leader may be, and I want you to consider this and do some thinking on your own about it, it may be that the possibility of being a leader isn't related to vision as an ideal. And then we have to begin to, well, what could vision be? How could it live if it wasn't going to live as an ideal? I have the sense that as an ideal, that vision in a domain of an observer giving an account will be something like an ideal, a remote possibility that we consider an ideal. The Hunger Project serves as a very, very good example for me in this case, because I've been close to the Hunger Project since its beginning, and I've been able to see what's happened to it in the world, and it kind of gets clear to me, and I can see that even in the beginning, I was kind of concerned about the end of hunger as an ideal. And one of the dangers about the end of hunger is that it's a very ready ideal. Very readily becomes the ideal. It would be right for people not to starve. It would be right for people's lives not to be damaged by an insufficient amount of nutrition. I mean, it kind of sits in the society as an ideal, as something right. And what motivates action in the field of hunger is this ideal of the end of hunger. And I'm really asking you to kind of consider that for yourself and look at it for yourself to see that what organizes people's behavior, why people make donations, why people are working, is that the end of hunger is a kind of an ideal. And not only is it an ideal, but everybody's happy with it as an ideal. We're ready to reinforce it as an ideal. We're ready to do business with the end of hunger as an ideal. In fact, it looks like the right place to do business. If you take this whole issue about ending hunger from the perspective of market research, you say, well, ending hunger, that's pretty good, that's hot in the marketplace because it's an ideal everybody has. Only I have the suspicion that things that live in the market as an ideal, that the action derived from ideals somehow don't make a difference. That is to say, somehow leaders are not working on vision as ideal, not that they don't know how to manage a vision as an ideal in the domain of an observer giving an account, but that vision cannot live like a power when leadership is going to happen as an ideal. One of the ways that I talked about the end of hunger is as a very practical matter. Not merely practical for the people who are hungry, and not merely practical for us who would benefit by having a world free of hunger, but from the perspective that if we did handle hunger, we would have said something to ourselves about who we are, the being of which would leave us in a more powerful place as human beings. Now, that's kind of something different than an ideal, if you can hear that. That's something you've got to kind of create for yourself and generate for yourself. It doesn't lie in the culture as an already something right, but rather it begins to be a new opening. You know, one of the things that I always said about what we did in space was that we really missed the real fallout benefit. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about the fallout benefits of our space program, such that we now have things that we can put on our tile floors that protect the tile floors better than we did before. They've come up with new materials to polish floors with as a fallout, and that's been very valuable, and lots of things in the medical profession. I just saw an ad for a hearing aid that's so small it just sits inside your ear. Surely some of that miniaturization was a fallout of the space program. But what never fell out of the space program was a saying to ourselves, like creating ourselves, that we can create possibility like an opportunity. That we don't just have the opening to create possibility like an ideal, but that we can create possibility in such a way that in the creation of the possibility we're empowered to realize the possibility. That we can create possibility such that the creation of the possibility mobilizes the forces to fulfill the possibility. That we can create possibility such that the creation of the possibility includes, incorporates, and actually makes use of what resists the possibility. So that fallout we never got. We kind of wound up reinforcing that we were as smart as we hoped we were, rather than we were bigger than we imagined we were. And I have the sense that vision as an ideal works something like that. So the question is, what is the nature of a vision that is appropriate to leadership? What is vision in leadership really? Not in the domain of an observer giving an account, and not in the domain of presence, but what is the domain of distinction in which vision would have to live. See, again, I'm trying to tease you into the distinctions rather than give you information. So over the years, people have come to me with more good ideas than you can shake a stick at. And I mean, man, really excited about the ideas. And good ideas. And it's clear to me, and it has been clear to me for a number of years, that there's a distinction between a good idea to which you're ready to devote your life and about which you can speak with enormous excitement, and a vision like a possibility. So I want to start to tease into existence that distinction for us. Those things about which we're excited. Those things which reach out and grab us and pull us in and own us. And that which lives as an authentic possibility, which invites an action which is ourselves. See, one of the things about a vision as it shows up in leadership, it seems to me, is that a participation in that vision and engaging in that vision is something very akin to what we have ordinarily called self-expression. That people somehow find themselves, when they're participating in a vision, as contrasted with a good idea. I don't know. But I know it needs our attention. That we need to break the code on this stuff people are excited about that are really good ideas, and for the moment I'll just give it a name, like a good idea, and a vision, which is something that has power beyond a good idea, power beyond the excitement, power beyond the argument for itself. So I don't know, but I want us to inquire into that, and the first place that I'd like to begin the inquiry is in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So who is on the phone from Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Peter.
Peter, hi.
Werner, my question has to do with practice. The metaphors that I hear you using for distinguishing leadership, like tennis and Aikido, imply practice. And so does perhaps the method of inquiry that you are asking us to engage in. And so my request is that you tell me about the role of practice in leadership.
Well, I don't really understand practice all that well, so it's something about which I'm curious, like inquiring into. One of the things that I'm satisfied with now is, if we use the analogy of riding a bicycle, one does not learn to ride a bicycle through practice. I say that you can get on a bicycle and fall off endlessly and never, quote, learn to ride a bicycle. I say that what happens when we say that the person is practicing and they've learned to ride a bicycle through practice is that somehow whatever it is we call practice, when we're speaking about it like a presence, is the opening for the creation of distinctions. So, we've got practice, which I'm saying in one way of interpreting what that means, as one interpretation, simply has no power, like you can get on a bicycle and fall off forever and never, quote, learn to ride a bicycle. I'm saying that the other interpretation of practice, as an opening for the establishment of distinctions, is interesting because it could learn to what we call riding a bicycle, wherein I assert that what we mean by I've learned to ride a bicycle is that I am the distinction. or to say that same thing in a different way, I am now a clearing in which balance can show up as distinguished from all of the other possibilities when I'm riding a bicycle. So when you first get on a bicycle, there's a whole myriad of sensations when you're sitting on the seat. The point is that those sensations show up in an insufficiently rich body of distinctions, so that one sensation is like another sensation, is like another sensation, is like another sensation. But as soon as you have the distinction, not the experience of balance, but as soon as you have the distinction balance, as soon as you are a clearing for balance to show up in, then those sensations of balance become distinguishable from those sensations of not being balanced. And with that distinction, you now begin to be familiar with the experience of balance and the experience of not balance. And then you have, in that process, the distinctions become richer. You become a clearing for those sensations of almost balance, and those sensations of no possibility for balance. And as the distinctions get richer, the body of experiences held in those distinctions build, and the distinctions become clearer, firmer, and that's what we call learning to ride a bicycle. But the first thing that happens in what we call learning to ride a bicycle is that you become a clearing for balance. So, practice then, if you take that interpretation, Peter, practice, at least in the beginning, might be an opportunity for the creation of distinctions. And that's what we would mean by practice. Well, if you were going to design a practice for the creation of distinctions, what you would call that practice would probably be inquiry. At least it would be something like what we mean by an inquiry. So, you don't say, when you're learning to ride a bicycle, how do I hold my body? Because even if you had that information, you wouldn't likely be able to ride the bicycle any better. What in fact happens is not learning how to hold your body, but you are a clearing in which balance can show up. Now, what happens is that the world of riding a bicycle has been transformed by the creation of distinctions. And in this transformed world of riding a bicycle, the correlated actions to the transformed world are what we call, oh, he can, like, is able to ride a bicycle. In other words, what I'm saying, and now I'm going to go back from the other end, those actions which we as observers would say, that's the ability to ride a bicycle. Because that's what we mean when we say this guy can ride a bicycle, this guy's able to ride a bicycle, this guy's got the skill to ride a bicycle. What we really mean is we're observing those actions consistent with riding a bicycle. Now, I say that a person's actions on a bicycle are not commensurate with any information about how to hold his body, or any information about how a bicycle works, or even any information about how balance works, but rather that a person's actions on a bicycle are a correlate with the world of the bicycle, the world of being on a bicycle. So that whatever way the world of being on a bicycle is construed, the way it's construed determines the actions on a bicycle. So, what the ability to ride a bicycle must mean is that the world of the bicycle or the world of riding a bicycle now is in a certain way. And the way in which a world of riding a bicycle is, when the actions are what we call able, is a world built out of a body of distinctions, and therefore it's the body of distinctions which are ultimately at the source of what we call an ability to ride a bicycle. Now, all of that process requires something, and I'm going to call that something practice. So I'm saying that practice is the process of building distinctions as clearings or openings for experience and action, which then get recorded as a body or a history of experiences. But here you have action not correlated with memory, action not correlated with history, action not correlated with information, but here by presence I mean action correlated with the in-the-worldness. So this is acting in the world. Presence could be said to be acting in the world. Or a more familiar term for you, presence could be said to be being in the world, where being or action is the front of my hand and the back of my hand is in the world. So notice that the front of my hand is correlated like an action with the back of my hand like an in the world. So I'm saying that what we call the ability to ride a bicycle, when we say over here, that guy's got the ability to ride a bicycle, what we're really observing are actions correlated with an in the world that produce bicycle riding, but the in the world to which the actions are correlated are generated by a body of distinctions like, for example, balance as a distinction, not balance as an idea and not balance as an experience, but balance as a distinction where one becomes the clearing for the experience of balance to appear. Then you've got action correlated to in the world. Peter, more about practice?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good. So that kind of gets us to maybe this is the domain of vision in leadership. If we said vision as a distinction, vision as a clearing, that would distinguish it from vision as an idea, as a good idea, vision as a description, vision as a definition. Let me define what I'm up to. That ain't a vision. Not a vision as a clearing. Let me explain. That's not vision as a clearing. Let me give you the reasons. Let me give you the justification. None of that would be vision as a clearing. Vision as an opening. Vision as an opening would be just exactly that. Vision in this domain would be vision as a clearing. And the clearing would allow certain experiences to be in the world. The vision would allow certain in the worldness for which action could be correlated. So this is a very different notion about vision. This is vision as a clearing, vision as an opening, vision as a possibility. And just to keep the ball rolling, vision as a stand. Now, the major problem with what we're talking about is that this domain of distinction doesn't exist, which is what explains why there ain't many leaders and why there is no environment for leadership. I mean, if what you need for leadership is something that doesn't exist, you're probably not going to have a lot of it. So nothing surprising about that. You see, these two domains you inherited, the domain of the observer giving the account and the domain of presence, you inherited when you showed up as a human being. They came with the territory. What it meant to be a human being when you got to this party called being human, already included in the culture of being, the domain of presence and the domain of an observer giving an account. Now, it's also true that what it means to be human has fallen, so that these two domains are now no longer domains of distinction but of collapse, but nevertheless you got them with the package. The point that I'm trying to make is that this domain didn't come with the package. And that means that in order for the possibility of vision as a clearing, you've got to invent or create or take a stand for that domain of distinction called the domain of distinction. Now, this is tough because it's all self-referential and it's hard to follow. In fact, it may not be able to be followed. You just got to be here for it. And being here for it either works or it doesn't. And we'll know whether it works based on whether you got any power, like being a leader, like being it, not understanding it. So I'm telling you that if this is difficult, it ought to be. And if it isn't, don't worry about it. So, until one takes the stand, that one is the stand one takes, there is no room for taking a stand. What that means is something like this. Until you stand that you are not what you think and what you feel and what fits for you and what you like and what you don't like and what you want, until you are able to stand that that isn't who you are, because that's what the culture of being gives you as a self. Until you take the stand that that isn't who you are, that you are the stand you take, there's no room to take a stand. See, people wonder about whether their commitments are authentic by addressing their feelings to see if their feelings are consistent with their commitments. Today you don't feel like it. Well, if who you are is what you feel, as in I feel, and I am the I referred to in the statement I feel, as long as you are the I, pointed to in this by the word I in the phrase I feel, I like, I want, I think, as long as you are that, there is no possibility for taking a stand. It's just another position. Until you are ready to consider the possibility of honoring your word as yourself. See, to honor your word as yourself leaves you with having a hand and having feelings, as contrasted with being your hand or being your feelings. See, nobody wants to throw out feeling. Nobody wants to throw out opinion. Nobody wants to throw out what you like and don't like and what you want and don't want. You couldn't throw them out if you tried. So it would be stupid to try to throw them out. It's who you are in the matter. And who you are in the matter, for most people, that's E. Cummings, most people. He said he didn't write his poetry for most people. Wrote his poetry for you and me. For most people, who they are is what they were given. They are anybody. That's who they are. Most people are not themselves, they're anybody. They're the anybody that the culture of being gave them. They are, I feel, I want, I like, I don't want. It's kind of like their feelings are the self-referentiality, chasing its tail. So I'm saying that possibly leadership is a phenomenon that arises in the stand that you are the stand you take, and you have feelings, and you have wants, and you have desires, and you have attachments. And all of that lives in a special kind of conversation. To take a stand is a special kind of conversation, and one of the inquiries into which we want to engage is what is the kind of conversation, distinguished from all that other noise, that the conversation of stand-taking is. But for the moment, I'm asking you to see that in order to have a vision as a vision, rather than a vision as a good idea, you have to create the possibility for vision. That is to say, you have to take the stand that you are the stand you take. And as Peter's helped us to see, that's going to require some practice. It's going to require some engaging with the possibility of taking the stand that you are the stand you take. Some practicing. Once you've got the domain of self as stand, once you're engaged in the inquiry of self as word, honoring your word as yourself, now we can discuss the possibility of a vision. And what, as far as I can tell, and I'm saying this to you like an invitation to your own inquiry, not like an answer, but a vision may distinguish itself from a good idea by not being dependent on anything. See, a good idea is always dependent on the argument which supports it. Be it the argument of a story made up of circumstances, or the argument of logic, or the argument of feeling. But somehow, a good idea, a position, lives on the foundation of an argument. Lives as is dependent on its foundation. Whereas a vision, while it may be accompanied by these arguments, while it may be accompanied by logic, while it may be accompanied by a story, I'm suggesting that you inquire into the possibility that vision lives on nothing. That it has no foundation. That it is groundless. That it depends on nothing. And I mean that like an active statement, not like an inactive statement. I don't mean it doesn't depend on anything. I mean literally it depends on nothing. It's actively committed to the nothing underneath itself. Now, always, when there's a new distinction born, we try to usurp it for our old business. Taking your good idea and saying it's ungrounded doesn't make it a vision. In fact, my guess is that this would hardly show up as a conversation in anybody with a vision. But rather than trying to understand our way through it, rather than trying to explain this to ourselves, although I know I'm giving you a lot of explanation, my real point is not to leave you with the explanation, but to leave you with the possibility to leave you with an opening in which you could stand on nothing for something. You could be for something with no dependency on your feelings or on your thoughts or on the story or on the circumstances or on the history. Not that there wouldn't be an accompanying story. Yeah.
This is Charles Beckjord.
Hi, Charles. Go ahead.
So my question is, if inquiry is a trick, as you called it, for presencing the matter being inquired about, how can you set up the inquiry so that, you kind of have a certainty that the matter of the inquiry will actually be produced?
Yeah, very good question. So I'm going to leap tall buildings with a single bound, which is always dangerous, and ask you to look into the listening behind your question and suggest to you that the listening behind your question is a request for certainty, as in a request for reducing the risk that a commitment to leadership is. That is to say, that there's a certain color to the clearing of your question, and the color really is that notion that we ought to know how to do it if we're going to be really potent in doing it. And I'm suggesting, Charles, that what's going on here is not a reduction of uncertainty. That this is not designed to reduce our uncertainty about leadership, but rather that it's designed to give us power in the innate and natural uncertainty which a commitment to leadership is. Now, that's part of my response. The other part of my response is that a possibility which dies as a possibility is never realized, probably will be retained as an ideal. So what's probably happened is that as a matter of our culture, our ideals are all those possibilities for being human which are now dead as possibilities and only live as ideals. And that really brings us to the role of vision in leadership and speaks to what we've discussed already about vision being in a distinct domain of its own, such that vision in leadership is the transformation of a possibility as an ideal to a possibility as a possibility. So what a leader does is to transform ideals into possibilities. Or let's say returns an ideal into the possibility of being for human beings. Shifts it from the domain of an observer giving an account where it lives like an ideal, where it got by failing as a possibility, into the domain of the possibility of being for human beings. Suddenly, what was an ideal before now lives as a possibility of being for human beings. That's very different from what one ought to do. That's very different than a prescription. That's very different than an explanation. That's very different than even a delineation. We always think that the vision's got to be delineated. Maybe not. maybe the real impact of leadership in the domain of vision is the transformation of an ideal, namely a failed possibility, to transform it by shifting its domain of being from the domain of an observer giving an account, even from the domain of presence, like something you experience, into the domain of possibility of being for human beings. You see, the end of hunger as the possibility of being for human beings is very different than the end of hunger as an ideal. A man on the moon as an ideal is very different than a man on the moon as a possibility of being for human beings. What we didn't get shaken out of the space program, the power that could have come from that, the knowledge that we can create possibility and fulfill it, that didn't come out of the space program, is that the space program became an ideal, got sold as an ideal, lived in the domain of ideal rather than living as the possibility of being for human beings. I mean, how could it? The possibility of being for human beings doesn't even exist in the world. That's not a distinction in the ontological space of being human. It is, by the way, the point to the forum. In case you might be wondering why we were doing the forum. Why we're doing the forum is to create in the culture of being human the possibility of being for human beings, rather than merely the inherited opening or options for being, which being human is. So I say, as a practical matter, like a tip, that a possibility is fulfilled by promises and requests, and that as a matter of fact, if you are a Martian looking at a leader, I say that what would be there like a presence is vision as a possibility of being for human beings, and unreasonable promises and requests as the opening for the fulfillment, or, Charles, to use your word, the realization of that vision, coupled on the backside with compassion, where by compassion I mean a profound sense of what people will need to bring forth in themselves to make good on the unreasonable promises and requests. So, what I've just done is to establish, like a space of possibility, what leadership might be. And in the process, Charles, hopefully I've given you a tip about what keeps one's visions from dying as a vision instead of being realized. Anything more, Charles?
No, thank you very much, Werner.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good, very useful. So, in part, I'd like you to consider the possibility that leadership is a conversation. And I say that if you were a Martian and you dropped in on a leader, and you didn't have all this interpretation in the domain of an observer giving an account, if you were just present for what's there in the leader, what you'd be seeing is a conversation. That's what would be present. Speaking and listening and everything that goes along in a conversation with speaking and listening. By speaking and listening, I don't just mean what comes out of your mouth and what goes into your ears. For instance, if I ask Bill for some water, he doesn't walk up here and throw a bucket on me. Because in the speaking and listening of my request is a background of shared practices, but that shared practices live in the languaging. They don't live like objects of something that happened. Trying to tease out a more powerful distinction for languaging, which I often indicate by the phrase speaking and listening. So I want you to take the case that leadership is a conversation, but a very special kind of conversation. It's not the kind of conversations in which we're ordinarily engaged, like, how was your weekend? That ain't leadership. How was your weekend? I like, fill in the blank. I'm excited about, fill in the blank. I don't like, fill in the blank. In order for this to happen, this has got to happen first. None of that is a conversation we call leadership. So the question is, what is the conversation we call leadership? If leadership is a conversation, and I'm going to ask you for the moment to stand in the case that leadership is a conversation. That when the Martian shows up, the guy from Mars shows up, and there's leadership, what he's going to see is people speaking and listening. A conversation. He's going to see languaging. He's not going to see courage. Even action is going to be languaging. It's not going to be action as action. It's going to be action as languaging, as a saying. So when the Martian shows up, all he's going to see is languaging. He's going to see a conversation. And what you and I need is a distinction in the domain of languaging that leadership is. That's the question. What is the distinction in the domain of languaging which leadership is? What is that special category of conversation which is leadership? What is that special listening which is leadership? What is that special speaking which is leadership? Yeah.
When someone is really actually leading, they are expecting or putting forth that there is more achievement ahead. You know, you can achieve something, but there's always more to go for.
Something maybe, Joy, like a context for what's being accomplished. So it's not only here's what there is to accomplish, but here's a context for what we're accomplishing. Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Yeah, so I would say that one would want to inquire into the possibility that leadership was, in part, that special kind of conversation in which there's a speaking and a listening of a context for the objectives or goals or wherever we're going. Very good.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Somebody else. Yeah, Susan?
Yeah, Werner. When I look at leadership, I know that it's almost like the word itself, leading. It's like you're out in front. And that when you're running out in front, or when you're taking whatever the project is you're working on and working on it and really moving with it, that almost in the wake of that movement comes others' participation, and they're following and they're wanting to learn from you or wanting to work with you or whatever. Whereas when I stop and turn around and like orchestrate and I like direct or I manage, then it's like standing still and it's not like being a leader.
Okay, again, you don't want to listen to what Susan's saying like the answer. You want to take what she's saying like a possibility into which to inquire. That leadership is a product of action. That the conversation is acting. And maybe Susan's suggesting that leaders don't act out of a strategy. You know, we all have a kind of strategy out of which we're acting. She's suggesting that leadership may be that special category of action which does not come from a strategy. It's not action based on strategy. Maybe she's suggesting that the strategy is based on action. Now,
Yeah.
somewhere along the line, I think you've got to look into the possibility that a leader is someone who acts into an opening and somehow is able to speak and listen to converse about that action in such a way that that action is an opening for others. See, it's one thing to step out on your own. That may not be leadership. It's another thing to step out on your own and have that stepping out live in a conversation which is an opening or a clearing for others to find their own stand in the matter, to be engaged. Sitting around figuring out how to be a leader, or sitting around figuring out how to lead, like sitting around figuring out how to lead your family, be a leader in your family, be a leader at your job, be a leader with your friends, may not be that special category of conversation which is leadership. See, you don't get heat out of a fireplace until you put the logs in. Most people want heat and then they'll put in the logs. Listen, you can't sit around and think about leadership and expect anything to happen. You can't wait for leadership to show up, to be engaged in creating leadership. You've got to be willing to be engaged in creating leadership for leadership to show up. Susan is suggesting to step out in action. Mm-hmm. And I'm suggesting with Susan that it's not just stepping out in action, but it's kind of like, to put it in very abstract terms, a stepping out in action for others. Which in practical terms would be a stepping out in action which lives in a conversation such that your action is an opening for other people, a possibility for other people.
Exactly.
Very good.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Sam?
I spent last weekend with a group of writers, and we got some professional writers to come and speak to us about entering the field of writing music. And I noticed during the course of this weekend that there were moments when progress would just seem to stop. And then someone, and it was usually one of these professionals, would say some version of progress just stopped. And it doesn't need to stop, or declaring that it broke down. And but they would do it in a way that they'd say, "Oh well, I can't." A lot of people would say, "This is really a hard struggle, to try to get it, a hard struggle." And they'd say, "Look, what you guys are saying is a hard struggle is what we do all day long. That's what being a professional is." And that you could sit there and listen to it as a struggle, or you could say, "Here's this whole other side of it, which is being successful." And so all week long, I've been noticing that when I felt like I had just been led, or all of a sudden when I would notice that here's this big opening, that something just opened for me, and I'd say, I just got led at that moment, and it was from someone saying to me, you're up against this breakdown, on the other side of which is this opportunity. And they'd say it in such a way that I saw what the opportunity was.
Okay, so Sam, what I hear you saying is that the kind of conversation that distinguishes a conversation called leadership has something to do with a conversation about breakdowns, which isn't merely an announcement that there's been a breakdown, or isn't really even engaged in the breakdown so much as it is engaged in something beyond the breakdown. I'm not saying this very powerfully because I don't want to I don't want to make a lot of conclusions about what you're saying. But that's what I kind of hear you saying. Yes?
Right. One guy said to me, he listened to this one piece of music I wrote, and he said, "It's a good piece of music, but it's not a great piece of music." But he said it to me in such a way like no one ever said that. He said it to me in such a way that I got to go home and start making distinctions about great music.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was just, but no one said it to me. I write well enough that I don't have anyone around to tell me I didn't write great.
Right.
And but this guy was qualified, and he did it in this way that was like, I have this whole area to go into now.
of greatness.
Yeah, I really love the way you said it
you know.
that time. That in pointing out the deficiency, in pointing out the missing, what was missing in Sam's music was greatness. But in pointing out what was missing, it was pointed out such that it was there for you like a possibility, not merely like something missing. So that may be a little bit of a clue here. To kind of take a look at maybe the conversation which leadership is a conversation about what's missing like an opening, what's missing like a possibility. Maybe what we were conversing about vision is a conversation about what's missing like a possibility. Worth looking into a little bit. Certainly, you and I are experts on what's missing in other people. We know what's wrong with our family and friends and our coworkers, clearly. Now, could we have a conversation about what's missing in our family and friends and coworkers such that the conversation about what's missing showed up like a possibility for them? I don't know, but that would be worth some inquiry, it would seem to me. See, maybe vision isn't drawn out of the sky. Maybe vision is drawn out of what's missing, but rather than what's missing like a missing, what's missing like a possibility. Not bad. Really worth looking at. I don't know. But it's really worth looking into that this whole notion about vision as something created out of nothing is false. I think it's valid as a tool, and I personally am committed to continuing the inquiry into vision as created from nothing. But when I look at my own operation, when I could authentically say I was leading, it's clear to me that it reflects exactly what Sam's sharing with us, and that is that I'm dealing with what's missing transformed into a possibility. That my speaking and listening, and you see, this is the critical part here for me. I know that one of the things that distinguishes me when I'm any good is that I'm listening for what's missing. And most people can't listen for what's missing. They can't listen to what's missing because it's invalidating and frightening, and they need the conversation and listening for what's good, because they need that evidence. So I've already accepted my badness, so I don't kind of need the evidence. Maybe, I don't know. But I do know for sure that I am listening for what's missing. When somebody presents something to me, I'm not looking. That's very strange because it flies in the face of all the good tips. See what you can find in there to praise. See what you can find in there to acknowledge. My listening is for what's missing. If somebody brings a piece of work to me, my listening is for what's missing. And my guess is that if I'm any good, if I'm of any value, I'm listening for what's missing like a possibility, not for what's missing like, too bad, nothing to do about that, that's missing. So I'm wondering if Sam hasn't begun to shed some light on this, what is leadership as a conversation. It's a conversation maybe about what's missing as a possibility. Anything else, Sam?
No, that's it.
Not bad, Sam. All the way back there. Carl, we need to stretch our neck in that direction.
One of this conversation, being here today, got very clear that I started it way back in Israel a couple of years ago. While I was in the army, I flew over to pick Golda Meir to take her someplace to give a lecture.
Yes.
And I was very excited about the opportunity because I wanted to see this leader that I've read about. I wanted to be with Golda Meir. You know what?
Right.
And I flew in with this expectation to be with this leader. And she was at the time right after completing being a prime minister. And it's myself and another friend, we walk into the airport in Jerusalem, and she's there sitting. And I walked in, I was looking for a leader.
Yeah, for the light.
For this leader.
Yeah.
And I saw what I was present to is grandmother. And I couldn't get over it for a long time. And then I had the opportunity to be with Shimon Peres, very close, and Menachem, begin in a very intimate situation, which is different. I was always asking myself, what is the distinction? Like, what shows up when you're being with them? I never found something when you're right there with them. There was people, and there was no leaders for them.
Very good.
See, matter of fact, in one situation, I was the leader. I had to, an opportunity to interact with Begin in a place when his life was in danger, and I had to get him out of there. And I was telling him what to do. So I'm looking what's a phenomena. And it's someplace in what Sam was talking about, that there's not only listening, but it's being with people like that. There's a humble about listening to people's requests in a different way. And we asked Golda Meir, we were in the same plane, so I asked her, tell me, God damn it, what's the trick? And, she was very humble, and she said that as a leader, the misunderstanding that people, where she's lack of power, when there's no power for her, is when people come to her to solve issues, like to come for an answer.
Yeah.
And all she wants as a prime minister is to get requests versus complaints.
Yeah.
And to have the kind of interaction that she can be useful, like you start speaking about, that so people to come to her with what's missing, so she can provide or open a conversation. So that's so I'm being with this kind of listening that is new for me. It's a listening to a request, but in such a way that what's left is people's action over there.
Yeah, very good. There's a distinction in there which I think we ought to tease out now and have as a part of this conversation, and that is that by the time we get around to saying leadership, whatever it was is all over. It's like in a home run. So a home run is when the ball goes over the fence, yes? So when a person says home run is when the ball goes over the fence. But by the time the ball goes over the fence, it's all over. In the same way, leadership is partly what Tal's telling us. By the time anybody gets around to saying leadership, it's all over. It's done. Finished. And Tal's saying that, by the time we get around to calling it leadership, by the time we get around to noticing that it's leadership, it's all over where it actually happened. So maybe the distinction that leadership is in a conversation, in the world of conversation, is a conversation that initiates a conversation. So there is that conversation which we call leadership. What about this conversation that isn't the ball went over the fence? What about the conversation before anybody uses the word leadership? Okay, my suggestion is that you consider that leadership is that special conversation which initiates a self-sustaining conversation, which self-sustaining conversation will probably be called leadership. But I want you to have a realm of inquiry now, which is not out there at the fence where the ball goes over the fence, not that realm in which we would use the word leadership, but another realm in which we probably wouldn't use the word leadership. See, like a guy standing in the batter's box, we don't call that a home run, do we? We don't call the guy swinging the bat a home run. We don't call the way the ball shows up for the guy swinging the bat a home run. But maybe that's where the real home run is. Not out where the ball goes over the fence, by which time you can do nothing about it anyhow. So I'm inviting you into an inquiry into leadership as that special conversation which initiates a self-sustaining conversation, which self-sustaining conversation is going to get called leadership, but back there where nobody's going to say it, where there isn't any conversation about leadership, there's a conversation that initiates a conversation. See, we take a look at Martin Luther King as an example of leadership. My guess is that what we call leadership was the ball going over the fence. And that the real leadership was exercised somewhere long before anybody wanted to use the term leader. What kind of a conversation might that be with your business associates, with your family, with your friends, with the people in your world? Could you open up possibility of being engaged in a conversation which was not ever going to be called leadership, but which would be a conversation that would initiate a self-sustaining conversation, which somebody might call leadership? See, by the time it was all happening with Martin Luther King, the leadership was all over, like what happened in the batter's box. It was now happening like going over the fence. So I want to give us an opening to be in a conversation with our colleagues and our friends and our family, such that we might be inquiring into the possibility of a conversation that initiates a self-sustaining conversation, one that other people are carrying on independent of you. Martin was not calling the shots. The civil rights movement was going on in people's actions and conversations all over the country. And maybe he had a conversation that initiated that self-sustaining conversation. See, and those kind of conversations are not had by leaders, because there ain't no leaders at that point. There are only, as Kyle's pointing out, people, grandmothers. Kyle, thank you very much. Elliot?
Yeah, that in looking at leadership, I started trying to sort out what was the difference between a leader and a visionary.
Very good.
That the leader gets up and says X, and the visionary gets up and says X. And yet the visionary gets up and says X, and nothing happens.
Yes, kind of satisfied with having said X.
Yeah, and the leader gets up and says X, and something happens.
Very good. If you're listening for what's missing, and now you got it as what's missing, what is the conversation which transforms what's missing from what's missing into a possibility? What's the conversation that takes what's missing and transforms it into a possibility?
Simply, it's a declaration that in a situation I've been involved in a negotiation, it was actually a project that came from the last Saturday series, that seemed to be very hopeless. And this discussion has been going on, but there's been one side with the leaders of one side have a set of positions, and the leader of the other side have a set of positions, which are my bosses, and nothing has been going on. Periodically they'll get together or they'll write to each other, but nothing happens. And I went out this time and I looked and I was sort of hanging out with the homework. And I said, well, gee, I'm just going to assert that we have a window of opportunity to settle this thing. And I said that to one side and they looked and they said, we do? Gee, let's talk. And I called up the other guys and I said, hey, we have a window of opportunity to settle this thing. I said, we do? Well, what are they saying? I said, well, I don't know what they're saying. Here's what I think might happen here. But I just kept asserting things.
Okay, so I want to just change one word in there. What I heard you say was that a what's missing, like a description of what's missing, is different than a what's missing like the declaration of a possibility.
Okay, but what I had seen in looking at this thing was simply that there was no conversation that anything was possible. All the conversation was there was no possibility in just positions.
Yeah, so to put that in technical language, what there were a series of assertions about what was so. An assertion is kind of a commitment that you've got evidence for what you're asserting. Let's just say for the moment, when we want to distinguish various kinds of actions in speech, that there's one kind of action in speech called an assertion, where that action is a commitment that you've got evidence for what you're saying. As contrasted with a declaration, which is not a commitment that you've got evidence for what you're saying, but merely a stand for something. So, never mind how you said it to them, but you were a stand for the possibility of getting the thing settled. And what that was a declaration that expressed in the words as a window of opportunity here.
Exactly. And I had been looking for something that wasn't jargon, or at least was jargon that they could hear, and I just flat said, we have a window of opportunity. But I had, in the last seminar we talked about you can say what you want, but you don't get to be arbitrary.
Right.
That it was real clear to me that I didn't just get to be arbitrary about that. I had to almost listen for the echo.
Very good. So, look, it's kind of interesting that we get where we're going inevitably always. That's great, Dwight. Thank you very much. This is a question which I've got fairly clearly formulated without any inkling of its resolution. But it's something like this. If you take creating, bringing forth, visioning, declaring a possibility, you need to recognize that it's going to meet with something that for the moment we'll call reality. I'm going to change that later. But for the moment we'll call it reality. So, Newton didn't create the possibility of a man on the moon because the technology wasn't there. So, yeah, it's true that when Kennedy made the declaration that it was a declaration, but it had to be met with a certain reality. So, my way of wanting to say that to you, the way I do say it to you is that leaders create possibility, but the possibility they create is not random, arbitrary, or capricious. You can't create any old possibility. So to kind of beg the question and not really get into it, you can say, leaders create authentic possibilities. But I want to get into it with you. At least I want to get into it like a question. Because I have the sense that until you've confronted this in a fairly powerful way, you're always going to have a sense of yourself as pretty limited. As in, you're always going to be frustrated. Look, it can't necessarily be the way you envision it. And that may not be invalidating. Because in fact, your vision someplace needs to meet reality. And your vision needs to accommodate reality in some way. So, in fact, if you stand on one side of that issue, you say, my visions are limited by reality. If you stand on the other side of that, you say, reality is limited by my vision. But neither sentence is of any validity by itself. So, look, I want to get us out of this silly kind of fanaticism that says you can do anything you can envision. Because you can't. And the opposite is not true, that it's only possible to do what reality allows. That our visioning has to be shaped by reality. Now, the one thing about which you can be certain, whatever is accomplished will be accomplished in reality, or it won't be accomplished. Because that's what we mean by accomplished, is something that happens in reality. So if you are a commitment for something now not allowed by reality, you better wake up and recognize that when it's accomplished, either reality will have changed or what we mean by reality will be reinterpreted. See, gravity was not possible. And Newton's commitment to gravity required a reinterpretation of reality. Ending smallpox was not allowed, was not real, was not allowed by reality. In this case, we didn't need a reinterpretation of reality. We needed an alteration in what was real. In Newton's case, we needed a reinterpretation of reality. What does reality mean? So I want us to start to get hard here. Like tough, hard. Tough in the sense that bamboo's tough. Not tough in the sense of rigid. But to see that that for which we stand, those realities to which we're committed that aren't already predictable and inevitable, are going to be realized in reality, and you better be shepherding your commitment such that it can be realized in what we call reality. Not out of that should you take it that we're limited to what reality says is possible. Nor should you be the fanatic who says that anything is possible, because in authentic visions, what I've called the commitment and what I've called reality have to meet. Now, here's the new distinction I want to invite you to. I want to invite you to a distinction called design. D-E-S-I-G-N. Design. And what I'd like you to be inquiring into is, what is this distinction called the design of the world, to which my commitments must be faithful in order to be authentic? See, if you take all of the buildings in the world, they don't tell you what's possible as a building. But in the practice of design, up comes what's possible in buildings, not predicated on all the buildings that have ever been designed. One more shot at that. We're all kind of clear, we think we're clear at least, that being an artist requires a certain freedom. You can't produce art by following the numbers. You can't produce art by following a set of rules. No one will produce any real art by following the rules of producing real art. No one will ever produce any real art by understanding thoroughly what constitutes real art. That real art needs some freedom in its exercise in order to produce real art. We're all convinced of that. What we often don't realize, that mere freedom will not produce art. See, I can go up there and slop paint all over the canvas, and that doesn't make it art. what freedom may be is not a lack of constraint, but a dancing with the design. And that's what I mean by design. See, nobody can say what art is. We can say what art was by taking all of the examples of art we've ever had and putting them all into a room. We could say that was art. But you can't say what art will be tomorrow, even if you've got all the examples of art. Because there's something brought forth from nothing, and in that sense there's a freedom, a bringing forth from nothing, which art is. Yet that bringing forth from nothing shows up in something. And I'm suggesting to you the distinction, like a new distinction, called not reality or the circumstances. Because I don't think there's any power in that one, but I'm recommending a distinction called design. And that what makes a commitment ring like a vision rather than a good idea or a position is that it's somehow you can hear that it fits the design. It's never been done before. It's impossible out of the circumstances, but it's somehow consistent with, like in a dance with the design. Now, I give you all of that in no way as information. What is unsaid by virtue of what I'm saying is where the opportunity to think for yourself lives. Don't think what I just said. What I said is brutally incomplete, but it does open up something that you can engage in by thinking for yourself, not if you think what I said, but if you'll stand on what I said and give thought in Heidegger's sense of thinking for yourself to the issues.
Leadership from Ideals to Possibilities was produced by Michael Portis for Werner, Erhard and Associates. Copyright Werner, Erhard, 1986.